two bodies, lifeless on the floor of the most sacred place on earth. No sword wounds, no signs of a struggle. Not a single drop of blood spilled on the sand. They were struck down in a fraction of a second, right in the middle of what should have been the greatest celebration of their lives. 3.5 millennia ago, a lethal mistake by two of the most untouchable and powerful men in Israel, right inside the tabernacle, exposed a terrifying reality that many choose to ignore. The presence of the Creator wasn't just a spectacle of glory and peace. It was an unforgiving reactor, a consuming fire, absolute death for anyone who thought they could bypass the protocol. What makes the elite of the faith cross a point of no return and turn to ashes in the blink of an eye? To understand the sheer gravity of the tragedy about to sweep through the Hebrew camp, we have to rewind the tape. We need to look at the scene just hours before the disaster. The sun beat down on the unforgiving sands of the Sinai desert. There, surrounded by more than 2 million Israelites fresh from the merciless whips of Egypt, stood a structure of surreal, intimidating beauty. The tabernacle wasn't just a glorified tent. It wasn't some religious ornament from an ancient tribe. It was the most important and lethal architectural project in human history, designed down to the very last inch by the Creator himself. We are talking about tons of pure gold, gleaming silver, solid bronze, and a heavy veil that served as a life-or-death border between the ordinary world and the inexplicable. And this specific day, documented in gritty detail in the 9th chapter of Leviticus, was opening day, the grand inauguration, the most anticipated event in the entire history of this nation of former slaves. Aaron, Moses' brother, along with his sons, and here the spotlight needs to hit the oldest two, Nadab and Abihu, had just endured a grueling, unbroken 7-day consecration process. They were literally locked at the entrance of the tent, purifying themselves, wearing the sacred linen, learning the hard way that dealing up close with the divine was not a game. And now, on the 8th day, the curtain on this historical spectacle was finally opening to the public. The entire camp held its breath. Anticipation hung heavy in the thick desert air. Moses and Aaron step into the tent of meeting, the absolute peak of spiritual tension. And when they step back out to bless the people, the impossible materializes right before the eyes of the crowd. The glory of the Lord didn't show up as a shiver down the spine or a fleeting emotion. It was a physical, terrifying, and indescribably magnificent manifestation. Ancient records state that a supernatural fire tore through the sky, came down with a controlled fury, and instantly devoured the first sacrifice on the bronze altar. This wasn't some cheap spark struck by human hands. It was the fiery finger of God, stamping that altar, declaring loud and clear, without a single spoken word, "I accept this offering. From this day forward, my home is right here among you." The reaction from the masses was a collective electric shock. The entire crowd fell into a state of visceral ecstasy. Sun-leathered old men, women, and children screamed at the top of their lungs and collapsed face down in the dirt, prostrate before the same God who had drowned Pharaoh's elite forces in the Red Sea. It was absolute confirmation. The Almighty had officially moved into the neighborhood. Before we uncover how this incalculable glory crumbled in a matter of seconds, I want to make a quick, sincere invitation. If you feel the hand of God working in your life today, and you love diving deep into these forgotten mysteries of the Word, go ahead and hit that like button down below. It seems like a small gesture, but it helps spread the raw, unfiltered truth to those who need it most. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. and drop a comment with your name and what city or country you're watching from. I really want to know how far our message of faith is traveling. Now back to that epic scene of absolute triumph. That moment had every right to go down in history as the happiest, most memorable day of the Hebrew journey, the unquestionable spiritual peak of a free people. The smell of sacrifice mixed with the profound relief of knowing the debt of sin was wiped clean. The glory radiated a blinding light, an armored harmony with no room for error. But human beings, especially the elite who think they're untouchable, have this terrible habit of testing the limits of the sacred. What no one in that weeping, joyful crowd suspected was the dark flip side of this spiritual coin. The exact same heavenly fire that came down to embrace the approved offering would be the very same fire that, in a matter of minutes, would melt the rebels from the inside out to enforce divine justice. That heaven-on-earth vibe was one false step away from becoming a clean carnage. The most glorious inauguration the world had ever seen was about to become the stage for the most traumatic funeral in the entire desert. For the true impact of this tragedy to hit home, we have to completely wipe out the idea that the men who died there were just clueless rookies. Forget the image of apprentices stumbling over the rulebook out of pure innocence or a lack of warning. What stained the floor of that sacred space was no workplace accident. It was the result of something much darker and far more dangerous. A character flaw that haunts the halls of absolute power. The arrogance of men who believe they are above the rules. Nadab and Abihu weren't at the bottom of Israel's social or religious pyramid. Quite the opposite. They were the oldest sons of the high priest, Aaron, and direct nephews of the great leader, Moses. Without an ounce of exaggeration, they represented the undisputed elite of that nation. These were men born with a pre-written destiny, educated and molded day in and day out to take total control of the worship system for millions of people. When they walked through the camp, they wore exclusive tunics woven from priceless threads, garments that instantly set them apart from any ordinary laborer sweating under the desert sun. But the true gravity of their mistake isn't just about the titles they held, it's about what they had already witnessed. If we open up the oldest historical records, specifically chapter 24 of Exodus, we crash head-on into a staggering detail. It's an account that completely shifts the weight of responsibility on these two men's shoulders. The Bible describes an event of a magnitude that defies normal comprehension. Moses was called up the terrifying Mount Sinai for a face-to-face meeting with the divine. But the key here is that he didn't go up alone. Moses took Aaron, 70 elders who led the people, and guess who else made the guest list? Nadab and Abihu. They were part of an ultra-exclusive elite squad. A tiny group of just 74 men cleared to cross the line into the dark cloud. And what this group experienced at the top of that rock crushes, once and for all, any defense claiming they just didn't know better. The sacred text pulls no punches. It states, point blank, that these men saw the God of Israel. It was a visual experience so overwhelming, so dense, that the record describes something like a pavement of sapphire under the Creator's feet, as bright and clear as the sky itself. And here's the most mind-blowing theological detail. The divine didn't strike them down. Just the opposite. The document says they ate and drank in the presence of God. Think about the absurd privilege of that scene. While the masses down below in the camp shook with terror at every crack of thunder, terrified of being struck dead, these two brothers took part in a covenant banquet at the peak of a mountain wrapped in flames. They stared directly into the abyss of pure, unfiltered spiritual power, and they walked away, breathing, intact. That is a level of heavenly intimacy no other human being down there could even dare to dream of. So, When you picture Nadab and Abihu gripping their censers at the entrance of the tabernacle, you have to keep in mind, they knew the exact voltage of that presence. They knew from first-hand experience that a wrong move on sacred ground wasn't a mistake you could fix with a quick apology. They had the most extreme masterclass in holiness the universe could possibly offer. And it's exactly because of this track record that their fatal mistake wasn't a technical error or a lack of training. It was sheer arrogance. They figured their high rank, their heavy-hitting last name, and the supernatural resume they'd built up would act like some kind of diplomatic immunity against the rules laid down by the Creator himself. They felt like they owned the place. They felt so entitled to the rituals, so incredibly tight with the sacred, that they decided they could dictate the terms of engagement. They thought they could improvise, do it their way, ignore the strict protocol. This blind, arrogant self-confidence turned two giants of the faith into the architects of their own destruction. The tragedy of that day wasn't the downfall of two rookies. It was the spectacular crash of two powerful men who thought they could tame the God who had just split the sea and set the mountain on fire. They took the honor of divine intimacy and twisted it into blatant disrespect. And when familiarity rots into audacity inside an environment that does not negotiate its rules, the result is completely lethal. The deep knowledge they had of God didn't protect them. In fact, it became the star witness against them. They knew, inch by inch, exactly what they were doing. The celebration outside was hitting its absolute peak. The roar of the ecstatic crowd cut through the hot desert air, and the smell of the sacrifice burning on the great bronze altar sealed that historic moment. It was the redemption of an entire nation. But while 2 million people were dialed in, revering the sacred, Nadab and Abihu figured it was the perfect time to steal the show. Without a single order from Moses, and without the high priest Aaron authorizing the move, the two brothers took a rogue action that would seal their fate in a matter of minutes. They grabbed their own censers. A censer was a vessel made of precious metal, hung by chains, used to burn intensely strong aromatic spices before God. Handling that tool was exactly what they had been trained their entire lives to do. The problem wasn't the equipment. The problem was what they decided to put inside it. The book of Leviticus opens its 10th chapter by describing the offense with a phrase that still echoes with heavy consequence today. They offered strange fire before the Lord. To an untrained eye, this might seem like a mere technicality, a minor bureaucratic glitch. But inside the hyper-regulated machinery of the tabernacle, this was classified as high spiritual treason. To grasp the sheer magnitude of the hole they were digging for themselves, you have to understand the mechanics of the place. The fire burning on the bronze altar outside wasn't your average flame. It hadn't been sparked by human hands rubbing sticks together on a whim. That fire had literally fallen from the sky. It was the Creator's own flame, the unmistakable signature proving he had accepted the people's offering. And the non-negotiable protocol was crystal clear. Any incense burned in the holy place absolutely had to be lit with coals taken directly from that specific altar. It was God's fire returning to God in the form of worship. There was no plan B. There was zero room for cutting corners. But Nadab and Abihu, blinded by the arrogant swagger of men who think they own the place, decided to improvise. Maybe they were just too lazy to walk out to the altar and fetch the sacred coals. Or worse, maybe they wanted to put on their own off-script show to prove to the crowd they had their own light. Whatever the reason, they grabbed common coals, profane fire, just some everyday domestic fire they found lying around the camp. They lit their incense with this unauthorized element and marched, chests puffed out, straight toward the most dangerous place on earth. They figured good intentions would justify breaking the rules. They genuinely believed their bulletproof resumes and heavy-hitting last name would make the Almighty turn a blind eye to their little stunt. It is the absolute essence of pride before the fall. Picture the sheer audacity of this scene. The bronze altar was right there in the courtyard, radiating brutal heat, the divine coals glowing a bright, angry red. All they had to do was follow the recipe. Just take the golden tongs, grab a coal from the approved fire, and drop it in the censer. But they turned their backs on what God had provided and opt for a cheap, alternative source. With that single move, they rubbed it in the face of divine justice, that their method was better, more practical, or just good enough. The smoke from that bootleg fire started to rise. They advanced into the sacred structure, crossing the strict borderline of the holy place. Every step they took toward the golden altar of incense was one step closer to the abyss. The atmosphere inside was heavy and silent, lit only by the flickering flames of the pure gold lampstand. They were completely alone in front of the invisible. They wanted the spotlight of spiritual leadership, the perks of being at the top, but they refused to bend the knee to strict obedience. They tried to approach the master of the universe, but on their own terms. It's like being invited to a royal banquet where formal attire is required under penalty of death, and showing up in shorts and flip-flops just to prove how tight you are with the king. There were no guards inside to stop their madness, but those giants of Israel had absolutely no idea that the profane smoke from their censers was about to trigger the most lethal, unforgiving defense system in existence. Offended holiness. The silence inside the holy place was thick, broken only by the metallic rattle of the censers in the brothers' hands. They pushed past the heavy curtain, and the smoke from that cheap, profane fire began to rise, choking the pure, gold-lined room. Look at their posture, chests out. The unshakable certainty that they were in control. They marched in fully convinced that the Creator would just swallow the breach of protocol and accept the offering however they wanted to dish it out. But the sacred does not negotiate. The exact second that unauthorized smoke touched the atmosphere of the most lethal room on the planet, the divine trigger was pulled. The response wasn't a warning. There was no crack of thunder to back them off, no prophet screaming at them to retreat. When holiness is attacked at its core, it doesn't debate. It neutralizes the threat with mathematical precision. The record in the 10th chapter of Leviticus is cold and direct. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them. Forget the idea of a lightning bolt shooting down from the clouds and punching a hole through the roof of the tent. What hit Nadab and Abihu was a colossal release of energy, a spiritual reactor that detonated from the inside out, radiating directly from the presence in the room. It was a silent flash of fury and justice confined within those walls. In a millisecond, before their muscles could even process the pain or their fingers could drop the metal, the two men collided head-on with absolute justice. That exact same fire that just minutes ago came down into the courtyard to embrace the sacrifice and celebrate the nation, now turned on the elite with full, devastating force. Here, we get into a terrifying piece of ancient forensics. Think about the physics of the event. If this were a regular fire accident, the first thing to turn to ash would be their clothes. These elite tunics were made of fine, pure linen, a fabric that goes up like dry paper. And yet, the 5th verse leaves a chilling piece of evidence regarding the nature of this judgment. The official document reports that when the corpses were dragged out, they were still wearing their sacred tunics, intact. The fire didn't melt the tent, it didn't warp the gold, and it didn't scorch a single thread of those priceless garments. This was a laser-locked execution, 100% focused on extinguishing biological life. They were pulverized from the inside out, a supernatural, internal combustion. The sheer voltage of offended glory passed right through the fabric without permission, shut down their nervous systems, and melted their flesh in an invisible fraction of time. No time to scream, no time to beg for mercy. The strike was so clean and sudden that the euphoric crowd outside just kept right on partying, completely oblivious to the fact that the highest-ranking members of the clergy had just been executed a few yards away. Arrogance had just slammed into its ultimate dead end. The giants who dined at Sinai and thought their status made them bulletproof were now just bodies crumpled on the floor. The censers rolled away, spilling their useless coals. What was supposed to be the ultimate power play of their careers became the most shocking crime scene in the desert. It was a punishment strictly proportional to their level of clearance. They knew way too much to make a mistake by accident, and the bill for that insolence was collected up front, with lethal interest. The thud of those bodies hitting the gold floor didn't just echo in the silence of the tent. It dropped like an anvil on Aaron's chest. Think about the psychological brutality of this scene, not as some distant fable, but as a raw human tragedy. Aaron, the aging high priest, the father who had spent the last week consecrating his sons, looking with a chest swollen with pride at the future of his bloodline, was now swallowing hard at the worst nightmare any parent could ever face. His two boys, the heirs to power, dead at his feet. Struck down in seconds by the very creator he swore to serve. The primal instinct of any father in that moment is undeniable. You collapse. You tear your clothes, rip out your beard, scream until your lungs give out, and throw yourself over the bodies. It is the heavy toll of pure, unadulterated despair knocking at the door. But before the first tear could even well up in the old man's eyes, before the first wail of grief could tear out of his throat, a figure cuts through the heavy air. Moses, the blood uncle of the victims. And right here, ancient history delivers what is perhaps the coldest, most terrifying order in the entire sacred text. Moses looks into his shell-shocked brother's eyes and, with the surgical detachment his office demanded, gives the command, "Do not uncover your heads, and do not tear your clothes, or you will die, and the Lord's wrath will strike the entire congregation." It was a bucket of ice water dumped over the soul of a man who was already broken into pieces. Can you even measure the absurd amount of pressure on the table right now? Moses was saying, point blank, that Aaron was forbidden from being a father. He was the high priest, the living bridge between the people and the sacred. If he showed a single sign of mourning, any weeping or outrage, the message to the nation would be clear. God's justice was too harsh. Unfair. It would be an open protest right in the judge's face. And the stakes were even higher. As the spiritual leader, if he gave in to the rebellion of grief, not only would he be struck dead right next to his sons, but he would pull the trigger on a mass execution against millions of people outside. The leader's tears would condemn the entire nation. Aaron was holding the life of Israel in his trembling hands. And it is in this exact moment that the biblical record captures this father's reaction with a phrase so short it hurts the soul. The original Hebrew says simply, Aaron remained silent. 3 words, the most deafening silence of all time. The old priest didn't argue. He didn't cry. He didn't complain. Aaron took the most gut-wrenching pain in the world and just swallowed it dry, like he was chewing broken glass. He locked his own heart in a vault so he wouldn't annihilate his people. The repressed agony of a man who had to choose between the blood of his sons and ironclad obedience to the God who had just executed them. The contrast of the scene puts a literal lump in your throat. Out in the courtyard, the crowd kept jumping, singing, and partying in a deafening collective ecstasy. Inside, just a few feet away, the most powerful man in Israel had to suffocate the greatest tragedy of his life in the most absolute, terrifying silence. The crime scene had to be cleared out fast. Divine protocol didn't hit pause for human grief, and those two bodies collapsed on the sacred floor were now an imminent contamination risk. Aaron's silence still hung in the air, heavy as lead, when Moses took control of the crisis with chilling tactical precision. He didn't call in the rank-and-file Levites. He didn't summon the camp guards. He sent directly for Mishael and Elzaphan, the first cousins of the deceased. Moses' order echoed dry, sharp, and stripped of all emotion. Come forward. Carry your cousins outside the camp, away from the front of the sanctuary. The tension radiating from those two men as they walked toward the epicenter of the tragedy must have been suffocating. They knew damn well that a single millimeter of error, one tiny slip in protocol, would leave them looking exactly like their cousins. They stepped into the courtyard, walking on eggshells, cold sweat pouring down their spines. The disturbing smell of burned human flesh, tragically mixed with the sweet aroma of profane incense, still hung heavily in the enclosed space. When they approached the corpses, they acted with extreme caution. They didn't dare touch the destroyed skin. The historical record is surgical in stating that they grabbed them by their linen tunics, those exact same priceless garments which just minutes ago represented the absolute peak of power, prestige, and vanity, now served as nothing more than an improvised body bag to drag out two dead men. The harsh sound of expensive fabric being dragged across the hard desert sand rang out like the final strike of a judge's gavel. Mishael and Elzaphan pulled the heavy, still-smoking bodies away from the sacred zone, tearing a path right through the thousands of tents. Think about the paralyzing shock of the crowd. The exact same people who, moments ago, were face down in the dirt, weeping tears of joy over divine approval, were now scrambling backward, tripping over each other just to clear a path. The corpses of the highest priestly tier being dragged and dumped outside the camp limits like toxic rubble. Blinding glory and absolute terror were walking arm in arm on the exact same afternoon. That brutal procession, dragging the elite through the dirt, wasn't just the funeral of two arrogant leaders. It was the definitive burial of Israel's innocence. From that exact second on, the collective mindset underwent a deep, irreversible mutation. The tabernacle completely lost its aura as just a comforting tent of forgiveness, some peaceful spot where grace simply wiped away mistakes without charging a toll. The sudden, violent death of the two brothers nailed an invisible, lethal danger sign right on the front door. The imposing structure of gold and animal skins was exposed for what it really was, a spiritual nuclear reactor pulsing right in the heart of the desert. A massive power source that sustained the lives of those who walked the line, but demanded a millimeter-perfect level of obedience under the threat of instant pulverization. The sacred stopped being intimate and became terrifying. The border dividing the Creator's favor from his unforgiving wrath proved to be as thin and sharp as a razor blade, and the lesson, branded by iron and fire into the soul of that generation, set the tone for centuries to come. Getting close to the Almighty was never a walk in the park, and familiarity, when corrupted by arrogance, is the fastest shortcut to the grave. When the dust finally settled on that fateful day, the lesson echoing across the desert transcended the history of that generation. The brutal incident in the heart of the tabernacle branded an uncomfortable truth into the mind of humanity, one that many still prefer to sweep under the rug. The divine fire burning inside wasn't some decorative element. It had two completely opposite functions, depending entirely on the posture of the person approaching it. It was pure mercy when it came down to consume an approved sacrifice, bringing peace, relief, and forgiveness to those who played by the book. But that very same fire morphed into an unforgiving justice, consuming the rebel and the arrogant fool who tried to mess with the established order. You cannot play games with the sacred. Exactly 3.5 millennia ago, Nadab and Abihu, the untouchable elite of Israel, paid with their own lives to leave a warning that still screams at us today. The Almighty does not take shortcuts. He isn't impressed by a bulletproof resume, a heavy-hitting last name, or empty good intentions. There are no loopholes, no spiritual workarounds when you are dealing with the Creator of the universe. Those two brothers tried to dictate the rules of the game and ended up pulverized, reminding us all that true intimacy demands absolute respect. What's your take on this brutal, historic passage of Scripture? It's the kind of account that really shakes up your faith, isn't it? Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. I make it a point to read what you think about the actions of these two men. And if this video helped you see the Bible in a deeper way, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming documentaries.